Well, I want to welcome you to part 2 of our little briefing on what is truth. And in this part, we're going to examine our boundaries further. We're going to explore a little bit about the time domain. And we're going to talk a little about, again, about entropy as the arrow of the time domain. Because the time domain is a very strange dimension. It can only go in one direction, generally. And entropy is the arrow of it. And we'll talk a little bit about negentropy. That's the opposite of entropy. It's a synonym for information of life. And we'll talk a little bit about extraterrestrial sources. We'll talk about qualifying your sources of information and testing your hypotheses a little bit. And so let's start by talking about the nature of time. And I'm going to start by asking you to remember what you learned in school about trigonometry. You may recall that in school we learned that a triangle, if we add up the angles in each of the 3 corners of a triangle, it adds up to 180 degrees. And that was true of any triangle that we encountered. And so suppose a couple of us went out to a large field with a transit, laid out a large triangle, and we added up the 3 angles of the 3 corners, and it added up to more than 180 degrees. What have we encountered? It turns out that what we have encountered is the curvature of the Earth. The little rule that we all learned in school about the triangles having only 180 degrees was true of a plane geometry. That is, it was only true of a universe of 2 dimensions. That's why they called it plane geometry or plane trigonometry. And if we violate that rule or encounter a violation of that rule, it's a hint that maybe we've encountered an additional dimension. If you take a course in navigation, that will include a course in spherical trigonometry where you can have 90 degrees in each of the corners. It's very different. So if you encounter a triangle with more than 180 degrees in the sum of the angles, you know that you're in a convex surface. If you have less than 180 degrees, it turns out you probably encountered a hyperbolic paraboloid, which I don't think is a concern to most of us. We'll move on. Okay. This was the kind of insight that led to Einstein to his revolutionary theory of special relativity in 1905, where he discovered that length, mass, and velocity in time are relative to the velocity of observers. But then he generalized that in 1915 to what we call the generalized theory of relativity, in which we know that there's no distinction between time and space. He realized that space is a 4-dimensional environment, not 3 as we visualize it. That time is just another dimension to our spatial environment. And this 4-dimensional continuum has been confirmed at least by 14 different ways to 19 decimals. It's a very useful predictive technology that's available to us today. But to get this idea across, its implications for you and me, I want to talk about gravitational time dilation. There are identical atomic clocks that are located at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder, Colorado. And one that's identical to it is also installed at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. These are fairly complex devices. They're very, very incredibly precise clocks. And they are both accurate to better than 1 second in a million years. They're very, very precise clocks, both at Greenwich and at Boulder. And the reason I remember I was on the board of directors of a company acquiring Frequency Time Systems, a company in Boston that made cesium clocks. And I have vivid memories of that board meeting where the president of this the company that we were acquiring was bragging about how their clocks are accurate to 1 second in a million years. And I raised my hand as an acquiring director, and I said, I have only 2 questions. How do you know? And who cares? Well, how do you know is because of the natural resonance of the cesium atom on which it's based. And who cares? Turns out the accuracy of your measurement of time determines the accuracy of your navigation. And it's these clocks that make, a version of these clocks, that make the global positioning satellite system work. That allows us the precision of geography that we enjoy today. But I want to get back to these 2 clocks at Greenwich and at Boulder. They're both accurate to 1 second per million years. The one at Boulder, National Institute of Science and Technology, it clicks 5 microseconds per year faster than the identical clock at Greenwich. So they're both very, very accurate. That's unquestioned. And yet the one at Boulder is 5 microseconds a year faster than the one at Greenwich. Which one's correct? Which one's correct? Turns out they both are correct. Time is actually different at Boulder and at Greenwich. At Boulder, the clock is at 5,400 feet above sea level. And at Greenwich, it's 80 feet above sea level. And because the difference of gravity, time itself is slightly different. If I had an atomic clock here on this platform and I raise it 1 meter, it will speed up by 1 part in 10 to the 16th. Not enough to adjust your personal schedules, but it's predictable and it is measurable. So time changes with gravity. These atomic clocks are faster by 10 to the 16th per meter elevation. Give you some other demonstrations. They actually ran an aircraft around the world with one of these clocks. The one that went eastward around the world lost 0.059 microseconds. The one that went westward gained 0.273 microseconds. Not a lot, but exactly what Einstein's theory of relativity predicted in view of all the factors involved. But the other thing you'll read about, if you get into a class on physics or read a textbook on physics on this subject, you'll always discuss, they almost always will make reference to 2 imaginary astronauts. Hypothetical, of course. And we're going to talk about the nearest star. There's a star called Alpha Centauri that's the closest to us. If you go to the night sky, there is a star by the name of Alpha Centauri. It's 4.5 light years away, light year being a measurement of distance. And for this trip, we're going to imagine that we're going to take one of these two astronauts are born at the same instant. One we're going to leave here. The other we're going to send to Alpha Centauri and back. So it's 4.5 light years away. We're going to send him there at half the speed of light. Let's assume we could do that. And here on the Earth, because it's 4.5 light years, it'll take him at half the speed of light, it'll take 9 years to get there and 9 years to get back. So here on the Earth, 18 years will have gone by for his round trip. But what about his clock? The clock on the spacecraft that he's going on. If we take the Lorentz transformations, which deals with this issue, it turns out on his clock, it'll only be 15 years, 7 months. In other words, he will return back to the Earth 2 years and 5 months younger than his twin brother. And if that doesn't bother you, you weren't listening carefully. That should disturb you. It demonstrates that time is a physical property that varies to certain factors. To dramatize this further, let's imagine we could send him almost at the speed of light, 99.99%. A lot of reasons we couldn't, but just to follow through the math here. At that speed, the round trip would take about 9 years. And on his clock, it would only be 33 days. So you would hope that he bought some shrewdly picked stocks before he left on his trip. Time is not uniform. Time is a physical property. We need to understand that because it will resolve many of our paradoxes that we discover in the Bible and elsewhere. Time varies with mass, acceleration, and gravity, among other things. So time is a physical property that varies. You and I exist in more than 3 dimensions. We exist in 4, we've decided. Certainly, some even say 10. So beyond, look, we talked about the different hyperspaces that have evolved in the physics world to the 10-dimensional conceptions that are prevalent today. Nachmanides, remember I mentioned, concluded that we live in 10 dimensions. Only 4 are knowable, and 6 are unknowable in his mind. Particle physicists say the same thing, in effect. 4 are directly measurable, the 3 spatial ones in time. 6 occur in less than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. The Bible seems to describe a universe that was good in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. But in Genesis chapter 3, a curse was placed on the earth as a result of Adam's sin, and it was drastically altered. And we believe that it was fractured in a way that left 4 physical dimensions available to us, and the remaining 6 we might call, for lack of a better term, the spiritual universe. We do know that there are other dimensions that for one reason or another are not directly accessible by us, but we also see evidence of trans-dimensional events occurring. Let's talk a little bit, let's go back to talking about time. Most of us, when we were in school, the teacher went to the blackboard and drew a line from left to right on the blackboard. In this arrow of time, we can move forward and look back. Right? We have history. For us, now is the present. The past is a memory. The future is a hope. Right? That's why they call now the present a present, right? It's a gift of the present. Looking what we can't do is we can't move back in time. There's lots of stories and literature of what we call time warps, but it only has happened in one case that I know of. It generally does not happen. There was one that became man and went back to a cross on our behalf. But we can't move back, but can we look forward? Not with predictability. We can make guesses, but we don't really see the future. When somebody accurately does see the future, it tends to get our attention. So in thermodynamics, remember I said there was the first law of the conservation of matter and energy. We're all familiar with that one. The entropy laws are the ones we're going to focus on here. The bondage of decay. The third one we generally don't deal with. But the bondage of decay is the one that's going to catch our attention right here. We have measures of information. Remember we talked about disorder versus order, noise versus signal, cacophony versus music, chaos versus cosmos, randomness versus design. On the left we call it entropy, on the right we call it information, and they're opposites to one another, and there is an intrinsic drift from information to entropy. We find a created universe that is highly ordered, and yet it is winding down. There are species that become extinct. There are, in fact, mountains that erode, etc., etc. Entropy in Scripture. It may surprise you to discover that the term entropy is all through the Scripture. Psalm 102, they shall perish, grow old as a garment. That's what it means. The earth will grow old like a garment. Heaven and earth will pass away. That may surprise many. Romans 8, Paul makes an interesting remark. He speaks of the creation itself will be ultimately set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. This phrase in Paul's letter causes those of us that take the Bible seriously to infer that the bondage of decay, the entropy laws, were a result of Genesis 3, not Genesis 1. And so I have a little thing I'd like to do here that I call your epistemological IQ test. I had a very strange thing occur in my workshop at home. I had a whole bunch of black and white beads that spilled on the floor. A little frustrated by that, but I didn't want it to happen again. So as I picked them up, I just decided to put them on a piece of string. So I picked them up off the floor randomly. There are 347 of them, it turns out. But as I put them on the string, I tied a knot so they wouldn't spill again. I could just pull them off when I needed them. But as I examined this, I was rather startled as I examined it more closely. Because as I looked at the beads, there was two, separated by one, two dots in Morse code is an I. A little over here, then, there was a dash and a dot. That in Morse code is an N. Well, that's curious. I went on. There's a dash and three dots. That is a, there's a dash, just a dash by itself. That's a T. There's four dots. That's an H. And then an E. And as I started to go down this, there's a G, an O. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It turns out that on this string, by just random chance, we have a sentence. The first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And what startled me about this all happened by accident. As I was picking up these beads off the floor, I got this particular thing all by random chance. I sense some of you think I'm putting you on. And I am, of course. You all smiling because you know what I'm describing is absurd. You haven't done the math, but you know that my attempt to sell you that this little string of events occurred by random chance is ridiculous. I can't sell you that no matter how clever I might try to be. Could these have happened by chance? Could this have occurred by random chance? Or did I do it deliberately? Frankly, as a radio ham, it took me about 10 minutes to do that. But I think the illustration is very, very useful. Because there are 347 beads. There is an alphabet of only 2, black and white. So it turns out to be a very simple equation in information theory. The probability of any particular sequence would be 2 raised to the 347th power. That's equivalent to 10 with 104 zeros after it. One chance in 10 with over 100 zeros after it. That is a very, very large number. In other words, that probability is very, very small. In physics, there's often the need, when you have what's called an asymptotic variable, a variable that approaches but never reaches some other variable. They call it asymptotic. There's a point at which, even though you know it goes on forever not touching, there's a point at which you need to cut it off for various operations. And so they have adopted what's called Borel's law. Any probability that's less than 10 with 50 zeros after it is defined as absurd. There's a point at which the probabilities get so ridiculously small that we just cut it off and call it absurd. And that's called Borel's law. Well, this isn't 10 to the 50th. This is 10 to the 104th. This is really absurd. And yet, it's interesting that we let our kids go to school where they're taught that hemoglobin, the hemoglobin molecule in our blood, happens to be made of amino acids, of course. It happens to have 574 of these amino acids drawn from an alphabet of 20. Now, that turns out to be a vastly more complex calculation than an alphabet of 2. And if you go through that math, it turns out to be 574 from an alphabet of 20, 10 to the 650th power. That is absurdly long. And only one of them is hemoglobin. If you don't have them in the right order, you get what's called hemoglobinopathy. It's fatal. And so if you change just one of these, they become, actually more than just a couple of these, you have hemoglobinopathy. So obviously, the idea that hemoglobin happened by chance is even more absurd than the little example I gave you here, obviously. And it's the impossibility of chance. These numbers are very, very big. There's only 10 to the 18th seconds in the history of the universe if you accept a 16 billion year life of the universe. If you do the math, in seconds, it's only 10 to the 18th. How many atoms are there in our galaxy? Only 10 to the 66th. There are only 10 to the 80th particles in our galaxy. So the probability is less than 10 to the 50, of course, finds it absurd. So the specificity of hemoglobin goes far beyond any conceptual possibility of it happening by some random process. A random process can't even produce symmetry, let alone design. Take a random number table and produce symmetry from it. This is equivalent to winning the state lottery, not just once. How many believe you could win the state lottery twice in a row? How about winning the state lottery 3 days in a row? You see how each one is as unlikely as the previous one squared, okay? And so this is equivalent to winning the lottery every day, 90 days in a row. That is really unlikely, okay? The genetic code is even more complex because it is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting digital code. And anyone that thinks that they could design a computer where you have one group designing the language and the other group designing the hardware and they never talk to each other, out of their minds. It takes incredible skill, coordination, and deliberate design to create such a creature. And we have here a code that is so sophisticated, self-replicating without error. It is error-correcting. It is a 3 out of 4 alphabet that includes punctuation. And with that, we have all of life defined in our DNA. And it even has punctuation, start and stop bits that sequence the sentences. I won't go through all of that here, but there is a basic equation that our kids are taught in school that if you take matter and energy and random processes, here I'm calling it entropy, that occasionally, not very often, but occasionally it can produce life. Do you realize that we could conduct an experiment in this? Let's see if it happens. I have here some matter, and it's in an open theodynamic system, which means that energy can enter and leave, because I can let it get warm, I can put it in the icebox, whatever. It also is optically transparent, which is incidental to our purpose. But I've got some matter. In fact, I've given the null hypothesis an advantage because I've got organic material here, not inorganic material. I've got organic material. Now, what they teach us in school is that matter plus energy plus entropy, randomness, will occasionally, maybe not frequently, occasionally produce life. So let's see if it has. I'm going to open this. And we have, of course, a seal on here. I wonder what that's for. But if we break this seal to see what we've really got here, to see if we have any new life in here. There's no new life, and aren't you glad? See, the only way there can be new life, there has to be a spore of some kind, some information added. The life that's here was the life that was there to begin with, namely the peanuts or whatever. The point is, we conduct over 1 billion experiments a year and have done it for more than 100 years and have never produced new life under these conditions because we go to great trouble to make sure. The entire food industry depends on the fact that this equation is incorrect. Matter plus energy plus entropy does not produce life. Matter plus energy plus information produces new life. To have new life, I've got to add some information. I can do that in the form of a germ, a spore, or something like that, is the way the information might get in there. But it takes some and what's interesting is the entire food industry depends on the fact that biogenesis is impossible. If it was possible, the food industry would be in jeopardy. And it's not. Not from that cause. And that's how they insure themselves with a seal. I mention this silly little example because every time you open now a jar of baby food or a jar of peanut butter, I want you to remember that biogenesis, as taught in the schools, is a fraud. When I for 30 years in corporate boardrooms, I served as a director of a dozen different public companies, chairman and CEO of 6 of those. But over that 30 years, we were subject to laws by the Securities Exchange Commission which would punish us severely for making a misstatement in any of our investment S1, various documents that we give to our investors. If the same laws that applied to us in the corporate world applied to the publishers of school textbooks, most of them would be in jail because they are littered with deliberate, knowing frauds. The basic question, which came first, the DNA or the proteins? It takes protein to make DNA. The DNA are made up of robots that make the proteins, and the proteins become the robots, 200,000 different kinds, that make up the city that we call a cell. They both had to be created at the same time to a consistent system architecture that implies design in spades. Thoughts, language, are not physical, they're conceptual. The death of Darwinism. Darwinians cannot explain the origin of life because they cannot explain the origin of information. It's information that's required to have life. Let's get back to linear time here again. We started talking about the time domain. I want to get back to this because it's very useful to each of us. The teacher went to the blackboard and drew a line from left to right, very typically. At the left end was the beginning of something, the birth of a famous person or the founding of an empire. The right end of that line might be the end of that person or that empire. How many of you made timelines in school? We all have, sure. Because of that experience, when we encounter the concept of eternity, we jump to the conclusion that it's sort of like a line that starts at infinity on the one end and goes to infinity on the right. That eternity is equivalent to having lots of time. Now that happens to make good poetry, but it happens to be bad physics. Because time implies mass. Time varies with mass, acceleration, gravity. And we're in disconnect here. The nature of God. Is God subject to restrictions of mass? I don't think so. Is God subject to acceleration? I don't think so. Is he subject to gravity? I don't think so. See, God is not simply somebody with lots of time. He's somebody outside the dimension of time altogether. And boy, that makes a difference. Does that make a difference? And it's the uniqueness of his personal imprint that he uses to authenticate his messages. If God has the technology to create us in the first place, he has the technology to get a message to us. The trick is, how does he authenticate it? How does he let us know that the message is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or a fraud? Isaiah makes this remark in 57:15. He says, "For thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity." And so he certainly has the technology to create us in the first place, but how does he authenticate his message so that we know that it is really from him and not a contrivance or a fraud? by declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, is just one of many passages we could quote in that direction. Do you remember Mr. and Mrs. Flat? Do you remember that as a three-dimensional person, I could approach this two-dimensional universe, and I had a proximity to either of them that's independent of their distance, and I would suggest also independent of time. My time is not the same as their time. Let's talk about the geometry of eternity for a minute. If I take this imaginary line that represents time and imagine my pulling it out towards you from the blackboard here, so to speak, and visualize this line now coming out at you from the screen. And let's put ourselves at a point in that we call the present. Behind us is the past. Ahead of us is the future. We're in the now right now. What's past is a memory. What's in the future is a hope. Now, for someone who is outside the dimensionality of that timeline, say in eternity, inhabiting eternity, that person can see the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. Let me give you an analogy. Let's assume that we were in Southern California watching the Rose Parade. We're sitting on the curb, and for several hours we watch coming from the front, around the corner comes the marching bands and the next float, and then the various whatever. For us, sitting on that curb, the parade is a sequence of events. Coming around that corner, going around, turning down the next street. For us, in the plane of that parade's existence, it's a sequential series of events. To someone who's not in the plane of its existence, say in a helicopter above the parade, they can look down and see the staging area where the floats are being organized. They can see the parade route, and they can also see where they're being disbanded. For someone who is not in the plane of its existence, they can simultaneously see the beginning and the end together, so to speak. A poor example in some respects, but it's maybe illustrative of what I'm suggesting here. So God is outside the dimensionality of time. So eternity is more than having lots of time. It's being outside the boundaries of our reality. Albert Einstein, my favorite quote of his, says, "People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." I love that. How vivid, how graphic. Our entire life has been committed to two strategic discoveries. You have in your laps, I hope, a collection of 66 books that we glibly call the Bible. 66 separate books that were compiled over 2,000 years, longer than the lifetime of any of the writers, obviously, and most of these writers didn't know each other. In fact, there's about 40 of them. Over 40 authors that penned 66 different books over several thousand years. The first discovery that you need to make for yourself is the discovery that it is an integrated message. I don't mean that it's simply a theme of the old fulfilled in the new. No, much more than that. I'm going to suggest that every detail we now discover is deliberately designed in anticipation of what follows. Now, if that's true, and you need to discover that for yourself, and I'll give you some examples here shortly, then that's the first discovery. We have an integrated message system, 66 separate books, 40 different guys, over thousands of years, in which every detail is anticipated by deliberate, skillful design. That leads to the second discovery that's even more startling, that you can demonstrate, you can prove that that origin of that message had to come from outside the time domain, simply because it anticipates with an astonishing precision history before it happens. And that is its authentication. Now, we have the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. It is a single integrated design. Every number, every place name is there deliberately. And Jesus gave a hint of that. Jesus said, "Think not that I come to destroy the Torah, the law, or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Now, a jot or a tittle is a Hebraism. A yot is one of the 22 Hebrew letters that you and I would mistake for an apostrophe. And the tittle is a little decorative hook on some of the letters. And so it's like saying, not the crossing of a T or the dotting of an I will pass until all the law is fulfilled. It's a call to taking it very seriously. There are, by at least one cataloging, there are over 8,000 predictive verses on almost 2,000 different predictions on 700 different matters. That's J. Barton Payne's encyclopedia. That's his particular cataloging of them. Now, if that's true, can we measure how confident we are? If we think, gee, some of us believe the Bible, sure, but how confident can we be? How sure can we be? Peter wrote in one of his letters, second letter, said, we have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He's, of course, alluding to Matthew 17, the transfiguration. But a few verses later, he goes on to say, even though he's speaking as an eyewitness, he says something startling. He says, we have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well to take heed as unto the light that shineth in a dark place until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. What on earth did he mean? He was an eyewitness, and yet he says we have even something better. We have the more sure word of prophecy. What on earth is he talking about? Lord Kelvin, William Thompson, known as Lord Kelvin, made an interesting remark. He says, until we can measure a thing, we really know very little about it. That's what drives many scientists to really measure things, to really make sure we understand them. Well, can we measure confidence? I want to anchor our following discussion on simply one manuscript fact. The Hebrew Scriptures that we call the Old Testament were translated into Greek by 270 BC. That's called the Septuagint version. We have many copies available in any bookstore. These Hebrew Scriptures contain over 300 prophecies that detail their coming Messiah. 300 of them. And let's take a look at a few of these. That he was to be of the David's family. He would be born of a virgin. He'd be born in Bethlehem. He would sojourn in Egypt. He would live in Galilee. Each one of these are from the Old Testament in Nazareth. He'd be announced by an Elijah-like herald. This would occasion the massacre of Bethlehem's children. It would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include the Gentiles. His ministry would be one of healing. He would teach through parables. He'd be disbelieved and rejected by the rulers. And it goes on. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, riding a donkey. He would be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. He would be like a smitten shepherd, be given vinegar and gall. They would cast lots for his garments. His side would be pierced. Not a bone would be broken. He would die among malefactors. His dying words were foretold. He'd be buried by a rich man. He would rise from the dead on the third day. And his resurrection would be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. This is just a sampling of a list of 300. What I'd like to do in the brief time we have remaining is to examine just 8 of these and come to some conclusions about them. Just 8. We're going to take the simplest ones. Let's take the first one. You've all read it on Christmas cards, if nothing else. Micah 5:2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. We could spend a whole hour just extracting the gems that are tucked away in this one verse, but we're going to extract just one fact. Where was the Messiah to be born? Obviously in Bethlehem. Question. What is the probability of any person taken at random over the last few thousand years of fulfilling this one? If the population of Bethlehem is less than 10,000 during that period of time, and if there's an average of, say, 1 billion people on the planet Earth, just picking that number out, if we divide that out, there's about one chance in 100,000 or less that a person that you pick at random is born in Bethlehem. Have any of you run into anyone in your travels that has been born in Bethlehem? Besides Jesus Christ. I'll set him aside. Okay. So I'm being generous by saying 1 in 100,000 is probably much more rare than that, but that's serve our purpose. Let's take another one. Again from Zechariah. It says, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, riding upon an ass, and upon the colt, the foal of an ass. Zechariah 9:9. And obviously Jesus Christ went out of his way to fulfill this very specific one. But how many people the last several thousand years have presented themselves as a king to Jerusalem riding a donkey? Well, I don't know of any, but if I say less than 1 in 100, I'm being generous? I think so. Let's take another one. I said to them, if you think good, give me my price, if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Familiar verse to many of us. How many people have been betrayed for precisely that amount? 30 pieces of silver. Well, I don't know of many, but that's probably not hard to do, so I'm going to say the probability of someone being betrayed for that specific price is less than 1 in 1,000. I think I'm being generous. Okay? Number 4, the Lord said to me, cast it to the potter. A goodly price that I was prized out of him. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now, this particular one may require a little more familiarity with the New Testament. You may recall that Judas, when he had betrayed Christ, when he saw that he was condemned, repented of himself, and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, what's that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went out and hanged himself. But then notice what happened next. The chief priests took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful for to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood. That was against the law. So they're sitting there on the floor. They can't put it in the treasury, but they had good CPAs on staff. They took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. What you need to understand is the temple had the obligation, when someone died in the precincts that wasn't anyone responsible for, the temple had to deal with the burial. So they couldn't put the money in the treasury, but what they could do is prepay anticipated expenses. And so what they did with it, they bought a field that would be a cheap place to acquit themselves of this obligation. Wherefore that field is called the field of blood to this day. Now I want you to notice the particulars here. The price was 30 pieces of silver. The location of the transaction was in the house of the Lord, that is in the temple, right? And who ends up with the money? The potter, the guy that owned that field. So it's interesting, those conditions are all met from Zechariah's prophecy. If I say the probability of this happening as a random occurrence, I'd say it's less than 100,000. Less than, probably, you could say 1 in a million, but this will suit our purposes. There's another one in Zechariah that is personally touching to me. It says, one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. When I first encountered this, in those days, I was a teenager and I was on a memory kick. So when I came across a prophetic thing, I'd type up a little card and put the verse on the one side and the reference on the other and try to learn it. I always carried a few of these as I tried to add to my repertoire. But as I tried to memorize this one, the more I tried, the more confused I got. Because I recognized that, it looked like prophecy at first, but I said, what are these wounds on my hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. And the more I thought about it, that didn't make sense. I could not visualize a group of Roman soldiers driving spikes through wrists on a bunch of 12 by 12s or whatever as being in the house of his friends. That just didn't compute for me. But I was reading the Gospel of John once and said, but Thomas was not with him that first night. The resurrection day, he appeared to the disciples, but Thomas was not among them. And the next day or so, they ran into Thomas and said, boy, you should have been at the Bible study last night. Guess who showed up? And Thomas was skeptical, you may recall. He said to them, except I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. That was Thomas's response. Well, after 8 days again, the disciples were within, and this time Thomas was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Then he said to Thomas, reach hither thy finger, behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. And be not faithless, but believing. Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. He said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. What I realized, it wasn't the nails that wounded Christ, it was Thomas's unbelief. Well, nevertheless, getting back to Zechariah 13:6, how many people, taken at random, have been wounded in their hands in the house of their friends in whatever context? And I see less than 1 in 1,000. I think I'm being generous. Let's take another one here. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He's brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Isaiah 53 is a chapter that details the crucifixion, even though it was written as a pillar passage in the Old Testament. How many people, prisoners, accused of a capital crime, make no defense even though they're innocent? How many prisoners accused of a capital crime, death penalty situation, make no defense even though innocent? If I say less than, there probably have been some, not many, but some. But if I say of all the prisoners, less than 1 in 1,000, I think I'm being generous. Are you with me so far? Okay. Another one from Isaiah 53, he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. How many died among the wicked and yet were buried with the rich? That should whittle it down, but if I say less than 1 in 1,000, I think I'm being gracious. One more, last one. We have to take one out of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 reads as if it was dictated first person singular as he hung on the cross, even though it was written 700 years earlier. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. Now, what makes this remarkable, this was written 700 years before crucifixion was invented. The official form of capital punishment in Israel was stoning. But here in their scriptures, the Messiah is to be crucified. It was invented by the Persians, widely adopted by the Romans. How many people, taken at random, in the last 2,000 years, have died by having their hands and feet pierced? There were many thousands, of course, but if I say less than 1 in 10,000 of the entire population, I'm being generous. Okay? So I've given you 8 prophecies we've selected here. Born in Bethlehem, king on a donkey, 30 pieces of silver, transaction in the temple to the potter and all of that, wounds in his hands, no defense though innocent, died with the wicked, grave with the rich, crucified. Now the question is, okay, we've got a priori probabilities estimated for each one of these 8 prophecies. Now the question we need to address is, okay, what's the probability that a particular person fulfilled all 8 of these? That's an exercise in composite probabilities, and for that we need a little tutorial background. Let's assume that in the audience here we have 100 people, and let's assume that 60% of the audience is male and 40% is female. What is the probability that if I picked one of you at random, I would pick a female? Well, the answer to that's pretty straightforward. It's 40%. Now, if there's 40 of 100 that are female, my random chance of picking one of you that's female would be a probability of 0.4 or 40%, depending how you want to express it. Okay, let me take a different example. Let's assume that we have a population that's 60% right-handed and 40% left-handed. And let's assume for this discussion that those properties are randomly distributed among the audience. That isn't always men that are right-handed or women left-handed, anything like that. That is uniform. If the population is 60% right-handed and 40% left-handed, what's the probability if I pick someone at random from the audience that is left-handed? What's the probability? 40% again, right? Okay, so now the question that leaves, okay, what's the probability of selecting a left-handed female? That's the thing between us. Well, I take the one distribution of left and right-handedness. I take the distribution of male and female, and I combine those 2 distributions. And what I'm looking for are those that have those 2 attributes in common. And obviously, if you go through the math here, that turns out to be 16%, or probably 0.16. What I'm trying to get across is why it is that in composite probabilities, we simply multiply the distributions. In other words, the probability of left-handedness times the probability of right-handedness, or female, or gender, I should say, gives me the probability of getting a left-handed female. Are you with me? Now, what that tells us to do then, with these 8 prophecies, I need to multiply these prophecies. The way I do that, I've done conveniently in powers of 10, and it's very simple to multiply them because I simply count the zeros. If I take 10 times 100, I just got 1,000. I just count the zeros. You follow me? So I have 10 with 28 zeros after it. Okay, that's the probability of one person fulfilling these 8 prophecies. But I got to divide that by the total population of the, that's involved. I'm going to assume it's about 10 to the 11th. So that gives me 10 to the 17th. 10 to the 28th divided by 10 to the 11th gives me 10 to the 17th. That's still a very big number. Now, if I was teaching a class in statistics and I wanted to get across to you, say, what is 1 chance in 100 mean, one way to do that is I could take a large bucket and put 100 silver dollars in it. I take one of the silver dollars and mark it with lipstick or with nail polish or something, and shake that up so that it has an equal chance of being anywhere. And my chance of picking the marked one, if I reach in there blindfolded and pick 1 silver dollar, my chance of picking up the silver dollar that was marked is 1 chance in 100. That's what we mean by a probability of 1 in 100. I can demonstrate that by the bucket. Well, now I need a bucket that'll hold 10 to the 17th silver dollars to get this across. Well, where do I do? Well, let's take, where do I get a bucket of 10 to the 17th silver dollars? I take the state of Texas, and I fill it with silver dollars. And when it gets 2 feet deep, I've got about 10 to the 17th silver dollars. And so I send someone in there, blindfolded, in such circumstances that he has an equal chance of getting any particular silver dollar. And when he picks up the one, the chance that he got the marked one is 1 chance in 10 to the 17th. You with me? Well, I only took 8 prophecies out of 300. I've got 300 to choose from. Let me take another 8, but to save time, I won't go through an analysis. I'm going to stipulate that the next 8 are no less likely than the first 8. Now, that's a fiction because the next 8 will be more precise and more rare. But let's ignore that. Let's assume that the next 8 are no less likely than the ones I picked. I've got 300 to choose from. So the next 8 would be more specific, but we're going to ignore that factor. Assuming no decrease in likelihoods, I have 10 to the 28th times 10 to the 28th, that's 10 to the 56th, and again I got to divide by 10 to the 11th. So now I have 10 to the 45th to deal with. How do I get a silver dollar? What kind of a bucket do I need now? Well, it turns out that I need build a ball of silver dollars that's 30 times the distance from the earth to the sun. And that will give me 10 to the 45th silver dollars. I'm just trying to get across how huge, absurdly huge, these probabilities have come so far. Let's do this one more time. This time I won't double, I'll triple it. I'll go from 16 to 48. And again, I have 300 to choose from. And assuming no decrease in likelihoods, I now have 10 to the 28th 6 times. That's 10 to the 168. I got to divide that by 10 to the 11th again, so now I have 10 to the 157th to build up. To try to demonstrate a probability of 10 to the 157th, silver dollars won't work, they're too big. So I'm going to indulge in an imaginary element here. It's the smallest thing that you can imagine. Let's make it an atom. We're going to make a ball of atoms. Okay, I need to get to 10 to the 157th. How am I going to do this? Well, if I make a ball of atoms involving every atom in our galaxy, that's 10 to the 66th. You say, well, gee, I'm a long way from 10 to the 157th. That's right. I need to make such a ball for every atom in the universe. That's 10 to the 66th. I'm 10 to the 66th now. At 10 to the 132nd, I'm still a long way from 10 to the 157th. I'm already beyond our ability to imagine this in the first place. I'm going to repeat this whole exercise every second since the universe began, assuming a 16 billion year lifetime. And now I'm only at 10 to the 149th. I've still got a long way to go. 10 to the 149th versus 10 to the 157th. I am still short by 100 million times. Now, I've obviously, in running out this exercise, gotten to beyond our threshold of conceptual reach here. But I want to point out that I've only dealt with 48 of over 300 prophecies. What am I trying to get at? I'm convinced that Jesus Christ was the Messiah of Israel. I'm more confident in that fact than I am my own name, my own existence. And I've incidentally skipped some of the most amazing of them. His detailed genealogy, the specific prediction of the precise day that the Messiah would present himself as king to Jerusalem, the Old Testament Midrashic prophecies, and a lot of others. Let me just pick one to give you a flavor of this. In Daniel chapter 9, Gabriel tells Daniel that from the commandment to restore to build Jerusalem, which is yet future to Daniel, unto the Mashiach Nagid, this is 5 centuries before the fact. Gabriel told Daniel that from the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem to the Messiah the King would be a particular period of time. This is recorded in the Septuagint, 3 centuries before Christ was born, 300 years before the event. Gabriel told Daniel that it would be, in effect, 173,880 days from that commandment to the Messiah being presented himself as king. Well, that commandment, we know, is the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, March 14th of 445 BC. And the only time that Jesus allowed himself to be presented as king is when he rode that donkey into Jerusalem in the event that we called the Triumphal Entry. And we're indebted to Sir Robert Anderson, who was knighted, head of Scotland Yard, whose landmark work in 1894 unveiled all of this to us. But if you go through the arithmetic of the calendars, from 445 BC to 32 AD, remember there's no year zero, 173,740. From March 14th to April 6th is 24 days, and you correct for leap years 116. I want you to notice that Gabriel's announcement was precise to the very day, 5 centuries before the event. Astonishing passage that there's just no way you can, with intellectual integrity, attribute this to random chance or accident. This message came from outside the dimensionality of time, from the Creator himself. The return of Christ to rule. There's over 1,800 references in the Old Testament. Christ is going to return to rule the planet Earth. 17 books give prominence to the event in the Old Testament. There are 318 references in the New Testament. In 216 chapters, make 23 of the 27 books give prominence to the event. For every prophecy of Christ's first coming that we've detailed, there are 8, or 7, more than 7 anyway, of his second coming. So our challenge, this is the challenge. If you accept this challenge, you flunk the course. I'm going to suggest to you a premise that I hope you will challenge. I believe that you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does any other period of time in human history, including the time that Jesus walked the shores of Galilee or climbed the mountains of Judea. Now, that's a preposterous statement, that you and I are moving into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does even of the gospel period. Now, how do you challenge that statement? You have to do 2 things. You have to find out what the Bible really says, not what Chuck Missler says or whoever is your favorite radio preacher or whatever. Find out yourself what the Bible really says. The second thing you need to do is find out what's really going on. And you won't on the 10 o'clock news. You need to do a little homework to find out what's really going on in the Middle East, in Europe, in China, in the technologies, in the churches, in the tides in government and so forth. We monitor in our institute, Koinonia Institute, we monitor a number of strategic trends. The struggle for Jerusalem, that's a category of intelligence gathering by every major intelligence agency on the planet Earth. The impending Magog invasion of the Middle East. The rise of Europe as a superstate. The rise of Asia, especially China. The movement towards a global government. The movement in religion for an ecumenical religion to fit everyone. The biotechnology and the advent of global pestilence. The decline of the United States as a major factor on the world scene. And the weapons of mass destruction and their proliferation throughout the world. These are just a few. They all have biblical relevance. They're all areas that you can do some research on. And you can. It's not as if there's one of these that's important. They all are converging on the classic biblical scenario that the Bible has said all along. Now, our epistemological approach that we've taken here is to first establish the integrity of design of the Scriptures itself. You don't have to wade through ancient manuscripts to do that. All you have to do is study the Bible. It's in your lap, and to discover that there are idioms in the Old Testament that make no sense except to the extent they're fulfilled in the New. Moses raises a brazen serpent in the wilderness on occasion. That makes no sense at all until you get to the New Testament. A brass serpent, they're all supposed to look at the hill, until Jesus explains it in John 3. As Moses raised the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be raised up. Abraham is told to offer his son Isaac on a mountain. And he knew he was acting out prophecy. He named the place after that. In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. He apparently realized that another father would offer his son on that exact spot 2,000 years later. We go on example after example after example. The more you study the Bible, you'll discover that there are unexplained events in the Old that have relevance only when you see in the New, and vice versa. Most of us as Christians are blind to much of what's there because we haven't done our homework in the Old Testament. The New Testament does not obsolete the Old, it fulfills it. It's one book. It's an integrated package. Once you establish the integrity of the design, then that will establish the identity of who Jesus Christ really is. Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, was a marvelous piece in many respects, but it has some misleading aspects. It gives you the impression that the crucifixion was a tragedy. It was an achievement planned before the foundation of the world. And he fulfilled it. We need to understand who Jesus Christ is. And then having established who he is, that authenticates the whole package. That's our epistemological approach. There are some additional forms of authentication I'll share with you very quickly that you might find provocative. There are hidden codes in the Bible. It says so. The glory of God to conceal a thing. It's the duty or honor of kings to search out a matter. A rabbi in the 16th century pointed out the secrets of the Torah, the books of Moses, are revealed in the skipping of letters. In the skipping of letters. There's the thing called the equidistant letter sequence. You can take a message And here's an example where if you just take every fourth letter, it gives you another message. If you take the fourth letter in this little fictitious message here, it says, read the code. It's a way of demonstrating you can hide a message inside another message by what's called an equidistant letter C. It's a very poor form of cryptography, but it's a very provocative form of authentication. If you take the book of Genesis, the books of Moses called the Torah. In Hebrew, that's 4 letters, the equivalent of T-O-R-H in Hebrew. You go to the first equivalent to a T, a tau, and you count 49 letters. You come to a Vav. You count 49 letters. You come to a Resh. You count 49 letters. You come to a Hey. That happens to express Torah. Remember, the Hebrew goes, all languages flow towards Jerusalem. Nations that are east of Jerusalem go from right to left, and nations that are west of Jerusalem go from left to right. But in any case, Hebrew goes from right to left, and the Hebrew letters are equivalent to, in our alphabet, T-O-R-H. You say, well, that's a curious accident here, 49-letter intervals, 7 squared for whatever reason. That's pretty interesting. When you get to the book of Exodus, you discover the same thing happens again. First Tau, then a Vav, 49 letters, then a Resh, and 49 letters, and a Hey. And again, we have Torah spelled in this strange way in the book of Exodus. Get to Leviticus, it doesn't happen. You almost feel a sense of relief. When you get to Numbers, you discover it happens in a strange way. It happens backwards. The same equivalent thing happens backwards. You have Torah spelled backwards. When you get to Deuteronomy, the same thing happens. It's spelled backwards. I have no idea how they discovered this. Must have had time on their hands. So we're puzzled by this. We look at Leviticus a second time. We discover that in intervals of 7, the square root of 49, we have a Yod, He, Vav, He, for the Yod, He, Vav, He, or the unpronounceable name of God. And now we discover that we have Genesis and Exodus, it's spelled forwards. Numbers and Deuteronomy, it's spelled backwards. That the Torah always points to the name of God. Now you say to yourself, gee, that's kind of curious. There's no way you can convince me this was an accident of random statistics. This was deliberate. Was it deliberate on the part of Moses? I doubt it. I believe that it's a fingerprint of the Holy Spirit, and it also implies that the Torah was given to him letter by letter, not just word by word. This is just an example. There are many of these. You get to Genesis 38, a tawdry tale of Judah having a child through his daughter-in-law. But we find in the passage of Genesis 38, we find at 49-letter intervals the name Boaz. That's curious. But again, we find 49-letter intervals following. We find the name Ruth. And then we find 49-letter intervals Obed. And then all this in the same chapter, 49-letter intervals, you find Yishai. And then 49-letter intervals, you find David. In other words, we have here Boaz, Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. This is the genealogy of the King David in the books of Moses, long before Joshua, long before Judges, long before Samuel. And they're all in 49-letter intervals, and they're all in chronological order. The probability of this being an accident of circumstance is absurd. There are authentication codes. There's a security monitor watching every single letter of the text that doesn't rust or wear out, running continually over the last several thousand years. The fingerprint of the author. And it's a non-compromisable design, interestingly enough. 7s occur in the Bible. How many of you notice 7s in the Bible? They occur in over 600 passages. Some are overt, some are structural, some are even hidden. They're called heptadic structures. Are they a signature of the Holy Spirit? I suspect they are. Let me give you a challenge. Imagine you were given this assignment in school. I want you to develop a genealogy from fiction, just from your imagination. But I want the number of words that you're going to turn in on your paper to be divisible by 7 evenly. In other words, if I count the number of words, divide by 7, there's no remainder. How many of you could do that? You could probably fudge and make that work out, couldn't you? But I want the number of letters also to be divisible by 7 exactly. That gets a little more challenging. See, the first rule, you've got 6 chances of losing, 1 of winning, but you can fudge around that one. The second rule, you've got 7 squared. You've got 1 chance of winning and 49 minus 1, 48, of losing. You follow me? So every time I add a rule, it increases your chances of missing. The number of vowels, the number of consonants divisible by 7. I can go on here. Number of words that begin with a vowel, number of words that begin with a consonant. the number of words that occur more than once, occur more than one form, only one form. Number of nouns that should be divisible by 7, only 7 words will not be nouns. By now you're probably saying you can't play, this is too rough. I don't blame you. So the number of male names shall be divisible by 7. Number of generations shall be divisible. And you probably guessed what I'm doing here. This happens to be a description of the genealogy of Jesus Christ as found in the first 11 verses of the New Testament. Now, for you to try to replicate this even from fiction and using a computer is a challenge. Did Matthew do this deliberately? He's talking about a real genealogy. And it's in Greek, not English. English you can fudge around. Every verb in Greek had to meet 5 conditions, and so on. Greek was very precise. Furthermore, Greek has alphanumerics like Hebrew does. Every letter has a numerical value. Well, it turns out the remainder of chapter 1, if I take, it has 161 words, that's multiple of 7, 105, it go right through the same kind of partitioning and counting. They're always multiples of 7 exactly. Very difficult to simulate, by the way, even if you're trying to do it on purpose. The childhood of Christ, chapter 2, again, we have the same kind of 7-fold heptadic structure. Again, I won't take you the long form through all this, except the more you get into it, the more astonishing it is. Now, see, for a rule of only 2, that's 7 times 7, you got 1 chance in 49 of getting it right. For 3 rules, 1 chance in 343 of getting it right. For 4 rules, it's 1 chance in 2,400. Well, I've given you 9 rules. That's less than 1 chance in 40 million of getting it by accident, just happening to getting it right. Would you like to try this? They're working 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. I'll give you 2 weeks off for vacation. That's 2,000 man-hours a year, or 120,000 minutes per year. You have 7 to 9th chances. You got to have 40 million attempts on a random basis, at an average of 10 minutes per attempt. That you could get this knocked off in about 3,362 years. Not likely that you could do it manually, okay? But it gets worse. And there's more to it than all of this. We're sharing with you the discoveries of Dr. Ivan Penin, who graduated from Harvard in 1882, discovered Christ as a PhD from Harvard. That's a real miracle. He discovered the heptadic structures underlying the biblical text in 1890. He's committed the rest of the 50 years of his life, generating 43,000 pages of discoveries. He went to the Lord in 1942. Comprehensive design. The New Testament consists of 27 books. And you go through the vocabularies, the geometrical value, the value of the longest, the shortest words. It's all multiples of 7 exactly. Astonishing. Here's a fascinating one. There's a vocabulary that's absolutely unique to the Gospel of Matthew. They're words that only Matthew uses. There are 42 of these. It's a multiple of 7. They have 126 letters. It's a multiple of 7. How could Matthew have organized this if he tried to do it deliberately? Only one of 2 ways. He'd get the other authors of the New Testament to agree not to use those words. I don't think that happened. Or you could argue from this phenomenon that his gospel must have been written last, because then he could look at all the others and make sure that these 42 were that this geometry be preserved. So all they have in common is that they're unique to Matthew. So I could use this argument to prove that Matthew wrote his gospel last. Except I can use the same argument for the Gospel of Mark, because its vocabulary is a multiple of 7 exactly, the words that are unique to Mark. The words that are unique to Luke are a multiple of 7 exactly. The Gospel of John. Each one of these wrote theirs last. Obviously not true. James, Peter, Jude, and Paul. All 8 of these guys have vocabularies that are unique to them, to their writings, that are multiple of 7 exactly. Do you detect the fingerprints of the Holy Spirit here? There is a design of experiments. Reality can be one case or another, and our hypothesis can be one case or another. If our hypothesis says it's true and it is true, that's a win. If our hypothesis says it's false and it is false, that's also a win. And our experiment was successful. Our decision was correct. You with me? If, however, we assume if it's really true and we think it's false, that's a type 1 error. If we think it's true and it's not true, that's a type 2 error. They take these labels from Neyman and Pearson in statistics. In other words, if your hypothesis fits reality, whether it's true or false, if it's correct, that's a win. If your hypothesis is just out of step, if you reject a true hypothesis or if you accept a false hypothesis, that's a type 1 or type 2 error in the design of experiments, which is a field of science. It's the mechanism by which we test hypotheses and try to determine what reality is. The problem is, of course, that no experiments are perfect. It'd be really great if they had a 99% of being correct. In other words, our hypothesis was such that if reality is true, there's a 99% chance of detecting it, or if the reality is false, we have in other words, no experiment's perfect. It always leaves some element of doubt. But if we've got a 99 and maybe a fraction % of being correct, that's considered fabulous, if you will. In real life, it's worse than that. It's probably a little more uncertain because our experiments are never, that's why we do many different kinds. There are some cases where there's absolutely no utility from the hypothesis because it has no discriminating ability. That's what you're trying to avoid in designing your experiments. Now, Pascal talked about a wager about God. If it's true and you accept God, that's fabulous. If God is real and you reject him, that is super bad. On the other hand, if God does not exist and you assume he does, well, that's still a small win. You've probably lived a better life. But if God does not exist and you assume he doesn't, that's a 0. You don't gain anything by that. That was Pascal's wager, as they call it. He says, in his classic piece of work back in 1670, he said, let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. That's to him a slam dunk. That's an easy decision. Why not give up that which you cannot keep in order to gain that which you cannot lose? That's really the epistemological problem that's facing each one of us. Why now? Because I believe we're being plunged in a period of time about which the Bible says more than any other period of time in history, including the time that Jesus walked the shores of Galilee and climbed the mountains of Judea. We are being plunged into a crisis period. To decline to take the Bible seriously can be a result of being unaware of what we know about the very boundaries of our own reality. Would you take a physics course using 1950 textbooks? I don't think so. Would you take a physics course with 1970 textbooks? Hardly. 1990? Probably not. The Bible has not changed, didn't need to. The more you know about the advancement of science, the more comfortable Genesis 1 reads. And if you don't believe that, take a look at our Genesis commentary. It's available. The ultimate truth is the person, the identity of Jesus Christ. He was the most anti-religious person that ever walked the face of the earth. This is not about religion. It's about relationship. Relationship with the personification of truth itself. It's the most important discovery of your life. Your eternal destiny depends upon it. Now, we are an international trust that has two parts. We have a publishing house called Koinonia House that's published this for you. We have an institute called the Koinonia Institute. The Koinonia House is an electronic publisher in the Christian field in a number of different media forms. We have one of the largest, oldest websites we invite you to take a look at. We have online fellowships around the world with that website. The Institute indulges strategic studies in geopolitics, in science, archaeology, and elsewhere. We have a network of research associates around the world that help feed us current events in this area. You can get graduate course credit for all our Bible studies and other studies. They are accepted by some universities. The Institute deals with 3 tracks. The Berean track takes after 1711 to be like the Bereans, receive the Word of God with all openness of mind, but search the Scriptures daily to prove whether those things really be so. The Issachar track, after the sons of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel had to do. That's our prophecy channel, if you will. And Koinonos is our 3rd track, taken after the 3rd commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, which we don't believe has anything to do with vocabulary. It has to do with ambassadorship. If you're going to represent the king, you better do it competently and faithfully. And our materials are accepted by Louisiana Baptist University, among others, all the way up to the PhD degree, up to half of all the requirements to a PhD degree. And our Berean things, commentaries, the Issachar studies the strategic trends and advocates becoming a master of one of them and perhaps enrolling as one of our research associates. And the Koinonos track deals with discipleship, small group participation. That's where real growth takes place among most people. Teaching assistantships, regional ambassadorships, and that's what we're all about. We're a Koinonia Institute, and we hope that you have a great time discovering the reality that the Bible really is true.